The heavy glass trophy on Arthur Vance's desk didn't make a sound when Julianne set it down, but the finalized divorce papers beside it fell as heavy as an anchor. For 3 long years, she had shrunk herself into the background of a cold, gray mansion, pretending that the silence from her husband, Gavin Thorne, was just the stress of a young CEO. She had trained herself to ignore the sharp, critical glances from her mother-in-law, Eleanor, convinced that love required enduring the thorns to keep the rose. But as she looked at her father, the shipping magnate whose empire spanned oceans, Julianne realized she had sacrificed her dignity for a man who viewed her only as a golden ticket. Arthur didn't look at the papers immediately. Instead, he watched the way his daughter's fingers trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirt. He had built a billionaire empire from nothing, but seeing the hollow look in Julianne's eyes made him feel entirely powerless. When she had insisted on marrying Gavin, Arthur had stepped back, wanting her to find happiness on her own terms, away from the shadow of the Vance fortune. He had even allowed Gavin's hand-picked associates into his own supply chain as a gesture of goodwill, believing it would secure his daughter's future. "He never looked at me, Dad," Julianne said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the expansive, high-rise office. "Not really. I was just a shield he used whenever his logistics firm started to sink. Every time they needed a lifeline, Eleanor would remind me how much Gavin sacrificed to marry a girl from a new money family." Arthur's jaw tightened, a dangerous stillness settling over him. "You told me he loved you for who you were. I want to believe it so badly that I ignored the numbers," Julianne confessed, a single, hot tear spilling over her lashes. She wiped it away quickly, replacing her sorrow with a sudden, rigid resolve. "While I was trying to figure out how to be a perfect housewife, Gavin was using our capital to fund his failing projects. He didn't just break my heart. He treated our family like an open vault." She leaned over the mahogany desk, her eyes locking onto her father's. The timid woman who had spent 3 years apologizing for things she didn't do was gone. In her place stood a Vance, fully aware of her own worth. "After the divorce, I told Dad, fire his cronies." Arthur didn't hesitate. The betrayal of his daughter was a betrayal of everything he had built. He pulled his executive laptop forward, his fingers moving with practiced, lethal precision. "They are embedded deep within our domestic ports, Julianne. Pulling them out will cause a tremor in the market. Let it shake," Julianne said, her heart hammering against her ribs, a mix of fear and liberation rushing through her veins. "They don't deserve our protection anymore." With a final, decisive keystroke, Arthur signed the executive orders. In an instant, the network of corrupt executives, sycophants, and managers that Gavin had strategically placed within Vance Enterprises to siphon resources were stripped of their access, their security badges, and their titles. It was a corporate execution, swift and total. Julianne walked to the massive floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling city skyline as the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon. The city looked peaceful from this high up, but she knew that across town, in the polished offices of Thorne Logistics, the red lights were about to start flashing. Her phone sat on the desk behind her, silent for now, but she knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. As the first drop of rain tapped against the glass, the screen lit up with a flash of incoming calls. The vibrating phone on the mahogany desk sounded like a ticking time bomb, the name Gavin flashing in bright, unforgiving letters against the glass. Julianne didn't answer it, nor did she answer the 3 consecutive calls that followed, but the digital storm had already crossed the city. By late afternoon, the sudden termination of Gavin's entire inner circle had sent shockwaves through the financial district. The network of enablers he relied on to prop up his failing logistics firm was gone, and the structural integrity of Thorne Logistics was beginning to crumble in real time. Julianne sought refuge in a quiet, brick-walled cafe 3 blocks from her father's office, hoping a cup of chamomile tea would steady her racing pulse. She had barely taken a sip when the overhead bell chimed aggressively, and a heavy scent of rain and expensive cologne filled the air. Gavin stood in the doorway, his tie loosened, his usually pristine hair uncharacteristically messy. The arrogant, untouchable CEO persona he wore like armor had completely cracked, replaced by a raw, desperate energy. "Julianne," he breathed, tracking her down to the corner booth and sliding into the seat opposite her, without an invitation. "You need to call your father. Right now. Tell him it was a mistake." Julianne looked at the man she had loved for years, searching his face for a glimmer of the person she thought she married. It wasn't a mistake, Gavin. It was an eviction. They were my people. Julianne, do you have any idea what this is doing to our supply lines? The market is panicking, Gavin said, his voice a harsh, low whisper as he leaned across the small table. His hands shook slightly as he gestured between them. I know things ended badly between us, but sabotage of my life's work? This isn't like you. You're better than this. I am better than this, Julianne replied, her voice remaining steady even as her chest tightened. That's exactly why those men are gone. They weren't just managing supply lines, Gavin. They were systematically draining Vance Enterprises to cover up your bad investments. I stayed quiet during 3 years of silent treatment and your mother's insults, but I won't let you rob my father. Gavin opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time, he looked at Julianne not as a submissive housewife who waited up for him with dinner, but as a woman who held the strings to his entire future. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of unsaid apologies and broken trust. He saw a fierce independence in her eyes that he had never bothered to notice before, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. Before he could speak again, his phone rang. It wasn't a business associate this time. The screen displayed his mother's name. Gavin answered it on speaker, his hand hovering over the device. Eleanor Thorne's voice, usually a model of aristocratic composure, was frantic, bordering on hysterical. Gavin, where are you? The private banking rep. Just called. They are threatening immediate foreclosure on the estate. They're saying our collateral is no longer valid because the Vance backing was withdrawn. Gavin, what did you do? Julianne watched the blood drain from her ex-husband's face. The transition from the city's elite high society to absolute financial ruin was happening in a matter of hours, a house of cards collapsing under its own weight. Gavin stared at Julianne, his eyes wide with sudden, terrifying realization of what they had lost, just as the sky outside finally broke open, pouring a torrential sheet of rain against the cafe window. The grandfather clock in the foyer of the Vance estate struck midnight, its heavy chime swallowed by the ferocious thunderstorm raging outside. Julianne stood near the grand staircase, a mug of warm milk untouched in her hands, staring at the rain lashing against the high arched windows. The house felt too large, too quiet, and far too empty compared to the crowded chaos of her emotions. She had spent years praying for a way out of her miserable marriage, but the cold reality of absolute victory felt surprisingly heavy. A sharp, persistent buzz from the security intercom shattered the silence. Julianne frowned, walking over the wall monitor. The external camera showed the iron gates of the estate, illuminated by a flash of lightning. Standing directly in front of the lens was a figure huddled under a broken umbrella, drenched from head to toe. Julianne, please. A voice cracked through the static of the speaker. It was a voice Julianne knew intimately, one that had spent 3 years criticizing her posture, her clothes, and her background. But the arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by a ragged, desperate sob. Please open the gate. I have nowhere else to go. Julianne's breath caught in her throat. She hit the release button and hurried down to the grand foyer, her heart hammering against her ribs. By the time the heavy oak front door swung open, the figure had stumbled into the warmth of the entryway. It was Eleanor Thorne, the woman who had once refused to sit at the same table, as Julianne's self-made father was completely unrecognizable. Her immaculate designer coat was soaked through, her expensive jewelry missing, and her hair plastered to her face. Stripped of her aristocratic pride, she looked fragile, old, and utterly broken. Before Julianne could even speak, Eleanor sank to her knees on the polished marble floor. The sight made Julianne take a step back in sheer disbelief. That night, my mother-in-law begged. I am sorry, Julianne. I am so sorry. Eleanor wept, her hands clutching at the hem of Julianne's sweatpants. The tears mixed with the rainwater dripping down her pale cheeks. Please, tell Arthur to stop the foreclosure. Don't let them take the house. It's all we have left. If we lose the estate, everyone will know. The shame will destroy us. Julianne looked down at the weeping woman, a profound wave of emotional conflict washing over her. Part of her wanted to feel vindicated. This was the woman who had made her feel worthless every single day. Yet, seeing a mother brought so low begging in a puddle of rainwater, tested Julianne's core capacity for empathy. "Stand up, Eleanor," Julianne said softly, reaching down to grab the older woman's trembling elbows. "Please don't do this." "I pushed Gavin to do it," Eleanor confessed, her voice shaking as she allowed Julianne to help her to a nearby bench. She buried her face in her wet hands. "I pushed him to exploit the Vance wealth. He didn't want to, Julianne, but I forced his hand. We were drowning in debt long before you married him, and I was desperate to hide it. I told him he had to use your family, or we would be ruined." Julianne froze, her hand still resting on Eleanor's shoulder. The room seemed to spin as the weight of the confession sank in. For 3 years, she believed Gavin was a cold-hearted opportunist who had used her willingly. But as Eleanor continued to sob, revealing the depth of their family secrets, the name scrawled at the top of the damp ledger page was far more tangled. Nor was it Eleanor reaching to her damp purse to pull out a crumpled ledger. Julianne saw a name written on the first page operating officer of her father's empire. Julianne stared at the elegant handwriting, the reality of the deception shifting under her feet like quicksand. The true architect of her misery wasn't the family she had married into, but the blood relative who sat across from her father at every Thanksgiving dinner. "Pierce knew everything," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling as she huddled under a warm blanket Julian had fetched. "He discovered our debts 4 years ago. He promised to liquidate our liabilities through Vance Enterprises, but only if Gavin agreed to place certain people into your father's domestic shipping ports. Pierce was using you to bleed my father dry," Julianne said, the pieces of the corporate puzzle slamming into place. "It was worse than that," Eleanor said, looking up with eyes full of genuine remorse. "When Gavin started to hesitate, when he wanted to tell you the truth, Pierce threatened us. He threatened to pull the trust fund that pays for Gavin's younger sister's specialized medical treatments abroad. Gavin didn't divorce you because he stopped loving you, Julianne." Pierce forced his hand. "He told Gavin that if he didn't cut ties and take the blame for the missing capital, he would ruin his sister's life." Julianne left Eleanor resting by the fire and drove to the tail end of the storm, her mind racing faster than the windshield wipers. She didn't go to her father. Instead, she drove straight to Gavin's cramped, temporary apartment on the edge of the city, a far cry from the luxury mansion they had once shared. When Gavin opened the door, he looked utterly defeated, his shirt wrinkled and dark circles shadowing his eyes. He didn't ask why she was there. He simply stepped aside to let her in. "Why didn't you just tell me?" Julianne demanded, throwing the photocopied ledger pages onto his small coffee table. "Did you really think I wouldn't have stood by you? That my father wouldn't have helped save your sister?" Gavin looked at the papers, a bitter, self-deprecating laugh escaping his lips. "Look what happened the moment your father found out about a fraction of it, Julianne. He pulled the plug. Pierce had us trapped. If I told you, Pierce would have accused me of corporate espionage immediately, and with his influence, my sister would have lost her care before we could even prove our innocence. I chose to let you hate me because it was the only way to keep my family safe." He walked over to her, stopping just inches away. For the first time in 3 years, the wall between them was completely gone. A single tear slipped down his cheek, and his voice broke. "Losing you was a price I paid to keep my sister alive. But every single day, I hated myself for what it did to your smile." Julianne looked into his eyes and saw the boy she had fallen in love with, completely stripped of the arrogant CEO facade. The betrayal was still real, but the villain had changed. As they stood in the quiet apartment, the shared grief and lingering affection between them hung heavily in the air. "We can't fight Pierce alone," Julianne said softly, reaching out to touch his arm. But he made one massive mistake. Gavin looked at her hand on his sleeve, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time. "What's that?" "He forgot that I am Arthur Vance's daughter," Julianne replied, her voice hardening with newfound purpose. "And he has no idea that we are about to hand him the rope to hang himself." The federal agents arrived at Vance Enterprises just as the morning sun began to reflect off the glass skyscraper, their dark suits contrasting sharply with the bright, optimistic dawn. Pierce Vance didn't even have time to clear his desk before the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Julianne stood beside her father at the end of the long executive corridor, watching her cousin's face turn from arrogant defiance to sheer panic as the evidence of his corporate espionage was paraded out in cardboard boxes. Arthur Vance kept a firm, supportive hand on his daughter's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement that she had not only saved his empire, but had done so with the fierce brilliance of a true Vance. With Pierce removed and the corrupt network dismantled, the heavy cloud that had hung over both families finally began to clear. Arthur, moved by the sheer depth of the sacrifice Gavin had made to protect his ailing sister, chose grace over retribution. Instead of letting Thorne Logistics collapse into bankruptcy, Arthur offered Gavin a lifeline, not as a dependent beneficiary, but as an independent subcontractor. Gavin would have to work from the ground up to rebuild his company's reputation, but the path was clear, honest, and entirely his own. A week after the arrest, Julianne met Eleanor in the quiet, sunlit garden of the Vance estate. The older woman looked fragile but peaceful, stripped of the heavy diamonds and defensive pride that had once defined her. She reached out, her hands trembling as she took Julianne's fingers in her own. "I spent years trying to teach you how to fit into our world, Julianne," Eleanor said, a soft, genuine tear tracking down her weathered cheek. "But the truth is, I should have been learning from you. You showed me what real nobility looks like. Thank you for saving my family, even after how terribly we treated yours." Julianne squeezed her former mother-in-law's hand, feeling a profound sense of closure wash over her. "We were all trapped in Pierce's shadow, Eleanor. Forgiveness is the only way we all move forward." Later that evening, Julianne walked down to the city's quiet waterfront, where the gentle lapping of the waves mirrored the newfound calm in her heart. Gavin was already there, leaning against the wooden railing, looking out at the sunset. When he turned to face her, the exhaustion was gone from his eyes, replaced by a quiet, vulnerable hope. "I don't expect things to go back to how they were," Gavin said softly, the breeze catching his jacket. "I know I failed you when it mattered most, Julianne. I should have trusted you with the truth from the very beginning." Julianne walked up beside him, looking out at the golden horizon. "We can't rewrite the past, Gavin, but we don't have to live in it anymore either. We hid behind walls for 3 years. Let's just start by getting to know who we actually are." Gavin offered a small, hesitant smile, his hand gently brushing against hers over the railing. For the first time, there were no secrets, no debts, and no corporate shadows between them. Just two people choosing to rebuild on a foundation of absolute truth. As the stars began to appear in the twilight sky, Julianne realized that true strength didn't lie in the power to destroy those who had caused her pain. It lay in the wisdom to uncover the truth, the courage to stand up for her own worth, and the profound grace to offer a second chance at redemption to a love that was almost lost forever.